In the year 2000, Nintendo gave to us one of the most mysterious gaming titles in the Legend of Zelda series, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. Within the game, there are many things that go unexplained or unanswered, and while there are many mysterious elements present within this game, nothing is more shrouded in mystery than that of the game's two most powerful masks, the Fierce Deity's mask and Majora's Mask itself. All over the internet I have seen people asking questions regarding these two particular masks, and when all the game provides you with are things like a shady backstory of the origins of Majora's Mask or vague in-game texts hinting towards the abilities of the Fierce Deity's mask, it isn't hard to understand why the questions exist. Fact of the matter is, we have very little information regarding these two masks to go on, and the minds behind the game have been very elusive, more or less keeping the mysteries intact. So as the mystery abounds, there have been many theories proposed to try and explain the hidden secrets of these masks. And while some tangible theories do exist, I have personally developed my own unique theory that I think would not only explain both masks' origins, but many other lingering questions that we have. But before we dive into my theory though, it is incredibly important that you at least have a basic understanding of the game. Without being at least somewhat familiar with the game's plot, most of what I say will probably sound foreign to you. So taking just a brief moment to summarize this game, The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask takes place not long after the events of the Ocarina of Time. Link is traveling on his horse Epona through the Lost Woods in search of his dear friend Navi. While in the midst of a seemingly fruitless search, Link is suddenly knocked unconscious when two fairies and a mischievous imp, better known as the Skull Kid wearing Majora's Mask, spook Link's horse. After ensuring that Link is out cold, the trio advance on Link and begin to search him over for valuables. It isn't long though before they come across Link's ocarina and start to fiddle around with it. While having their fun playing the ocarina, neither the Skull Kid nor the two fairies accompanying him notice when Link starts to come around. By the time that the group does take notice, however, they also come to realize how much trouble they are in. In an effort to escape, the Skull Kid jumps on Epona and begins to ride her through the woods with Link in hot pursuit. After chasing the Skull Kid for a while, Link eventually ends up in this mysterious parallel world known as Termina, a land that is doomed to be destroyed in 3 days by a falling moon. After reacquiring his ocarina and learning the Song of Time, Link sets out on an adventure to stop the masked Skull Kid and save the land. During his adventure, Link would end up releasing 4 guardian deities from their respective prisons, acquire a bundle of masks from the people of Termina after restoring their happiness, and ultimately stop the impending destruction by confronting the true villain, Majora's Mask, and destroying the evil entity inside of it. Following his victory over Majora, Link bidded farewell to the land of Termina and those he befriended on his journey before proceeding on with his search. With a new or fresh understanding of the game's plot, we can redirect our attention now back to the mysteries surrounding Majora's Mask and the Fierce Deity's mask. Two masks of such incredible power that they are classified as gods, and yet so mysterious that we know so little about them. Most of what I'm going to say in my theory about these masks is based around speculation, but before revealing my thoughts on the subject, I would like to establish a foundation of facts to work off of first. While it's true that this particular game gives us very little information regarding these two masks to work with, it does at least provide us with something to look at. So without further ado, let's take a look at the facts the game does give to us regarding these two masks, starting with Majora's Mask. While we don't know what Majora's Mask is, we do at least know where it came from. We can learn of the mask's origin through its discoverer, the Happy Mask Salesman. From this man, we learn that Majora's Mask was originally created by an ancient unnamed tribe to be used in their hexing rituals. At some point, though, the tribe began to fear what catastrophes might come about from the mask's misuse. So to prevent a potential apocalypse, they sealed the mask away in the shadows. There it remained, lost to the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years, until it was rediscovered by the Happy Mask Salesman and added to his collection. Sometime later, while in the midst of one of his travels, the Happy Mask Salesman was knocked unconscious by the mischievous Skull Kid and the mask was stolen from him. After the Skull Kid put the mask on, the dark entity from within the mask slowly began to come alive and take control. Over the course of time, the dark spirit within the mask used its great power and set Termina on the path to complete and total destruction. From the Happy Mask Salesman, we at least have something of an origin for Majora's Mask. A shadowy origin perhaps, but an origin nonetheless. And while we again don't know what exactly is confined inside of Majora's Mask, it would be pretty safe to say that the mask houses a powerful dark entity with a thirst for destruction. That's pretty obvious to deduce throughout the course of the game. Strangely enough, while we at least have some knowledge about where Majora's Mask came from and to some degree what it possibly is, there is unfortunately even less information we can gather regarding the Fierce Deity's mask. But with that said, despite the even greater mystery surrounding the Fierce Deity's mask, the game still does provide us with something to look at, even if it is incredibly vague. So shifting gears for just a moment to look at the facts we can acquire about the Fierce Deity's mask. The Fierce Deity's mask is given no origin within this game. In order to obtain this mysterious mask, after Link follows Majora's Mask into the moon, he must talk to these 4 masked children who inhabit the moon and partake in their various mini-quests. Upon completing these quests, Link will then be asked to give away to the children all the masks he acquired throughout his adventure. Once this is done and all the masks are gone, Link then has to talk to the child wearing Majora's Mask. Upon doing so, the child will simply give Link the Fierce Deity's mask where an in-game text hints towards the mask being potentially as evil as Majora's Mask. From there, the child will insist that Link play a game of good guys versus bad guys with him and refers to both Link and the mask he gives him as the bad guy in their game. Aside from the child giving the Fierce Deity's mask to Link, and in-game text hinting towards the mask's evil nature, and the child referring to Link and the mask as the bad guy, the only other information we get to possibly explain anything about the Fierce Deity's mask is from a hidden gossip stone in Termina. The gossip stone reveals that the Fierce Deity's mask is said to possess the merits of all the other masks. Aside from that, however, there is nothing else within the game that would possibly explain what the Fierce Deity's mask is or where it even came from. So with this present foundation of information given to us by the game, I am sure you are left with a lot of questions just like I know I was. Some obvious ones that come to mind are questions like, who was the ancient tribe that sealed Majora's Mask away? Why did Majora's Mask have the Fierce Deity's mask? Where did the Fierce Deity's mask even come from? So many questions arise from what little information we are provided, leaving us to speculate many different things to try and fill in the missing gaps. Strangely enough, while the game's vague nature does leave more questions than answers, I have ironically come to my theory to fill in these missing gaps by taking a deeper look at the game and going beyond the initial surface. I truly believe that all the answers that we seek can be found by looking at one simple thing: the motives behind Majora's Mask's desire to destroy Termina. In the game, it is pretty obvious that Majora's Mask wants to destroy the land of Termina. Anyone with eyes can see just how obvious that is. But the question that I have though is why and to what extent? The mask isn't aiming to destroy just one section of Termina, it's clearly trying to destroy the land entirely. And it chooses to do so with a falling asteroid moon that is designed to, as the moon said itself, consume everything. When the moon does ultimately come down, it will clearly destroy everything, but might one of the victims be Majora's Mask itself? It is certainly possible that the mask could survive the pending apocalypse, but choosing to destroy the land with an asteroid moon is incredibly risky, even seemingly suicidal. And if that is the case, I am left to wonder, why? Why would Majora's Mask want to destroy the land of Termina at a potentially fatal cost? In many Zelda games, villains within the series don't usually want to destroy something without having some kind of clear motive or goal in mind first. Such was the case when Ganondorf attempted to destroy the Goron race in the Ocarina of Time to make an example of those who would oppose him, or Zan's threats to kill the Hylian soldiers and Zelda herself in the Twilight Princess to bring about Hyrule's submission. Majora's Mask, though, doesn't seem to have any kind of motive for destroying the land of Termina other than just wanting to destroy it, and it honestly makes no sense at all. What would Majora's Mask have to gain from destroying the land of Termina? Even more puzzling, at what cost would Majora be willing to see the land's destruction come to pass? For what purpose would you seek to destroy something without any regard to the costs, even if it meant sacrificing your very life in the process? Now you could make the case that Majora's Mask is simply insane, and based off of how he fought Link in their final battle, that would be a fair assessment. However, the way that Majora orchestrated the events of the game actually seems to tell a different story. Everything from sealing away the land's guardians to prevent their interference with his goals to the final act of bringing Link to his home turf for their final battle doesn't seem like the works of an insane individual. It's actually more telling of a brilliant strategist or a diabolical genius. Majora's sanity aside though, the question still remains. Why would Majora want to destroy the land of Termina at a seemingly fatal cost? It is here where my theory actually begins. Based off of how far Majora is willing to go to see Termina destroyed, I would theorize that the mask is actually seeking some sort of revenge. What best supports this theory aside from the theoretical risk Majora is taking is how the Dark Entity leads Termina up to its destruction. Rather than simply destroying Termina outright, which Majora clearly has the power to do, the Dark Being spends a considerable amount of time and energy making the inhabitants of Termina miserable. Whether it was from the poisoned waters of the swamp, the eternal winter in the mountains, a deadly murk of the ocean, or a curse of death and war in the canyons, not one soul was spared from the agony caused by the mask. And that raises a very interesting question. If your end goal is to destroy Termina, why go to the trouble of making its inhabitants miserable beforehand, especially if this is a parent suicide mission? The most logical explanation that I can think of for this is that Majora's motives are most likely driven by vengeance. Why else would this dark entity go to such extreme lengths both in preparation and execution of its ultimate goal? If that is the case and Majora is seeking some sort of revenge, another interesting question arises. Why would Majora's motives be driven by vengeance? The reasons behind Majora's vengeful motives can be a bit hard to pinpoint exactly, but I believe that we can find those reasons by looking at who I think Majora is seeking revenge against. I realize that with Termina heading for a total apocalypse, it can be hard to identify the true targets of Majora's scorn, if any. However, there is one telling sign that points to who Majora's intended target is. That sign comes in the form of the moon's intended location of impact. If you look at where the moon is descending exactly, you will notice that it is coming down directly on Clocktown. I think the location of the moon's impact is quite telling. It's pretty much assured that wherever the moon falls, Termina is going to be completely destroyed. Yet while there are 4 other prime locations Majora could have dropped his asteroid moon on, the Dark Entity instead chooses to drop it directly on Clocktown. So why exactly would Majora want to drop his nuclear missile, so to speak, directly on Clocktown? The best explanation for explaining the moon's targeted location of impact is that Majora's intended targets are actually the inhabitants of Clocktown. Filled mostly with people of the Terminan race, I've come to believe that Majora is seeking revenge against those who are of Terminan descent. Now I realize that claiming Majora is out to destroy the Terminan race in an act of revenge is a pretty wild theory, one that is a bit hard to grasp as reality. But if for the sake of argument Majora is trying to destroy the Terminan race as I suggest, we still have no clear explanation as to why Majora is seeking revenge. What could the Terminans have done that was so horrible that it warranted the vengeance and scorn of this dark entity? Even bolder than my previous statement was, I believe the reason Majora is seeking revenge against the Terminan race specifically is because the Terminans are somehow linked, if not even direct descendants, of the very unidentified tribe that sealed Majora's Mask away in the shadows. That statement might seem like nothing more than a bold claim, but if you were to look at everything I presented thus far from an aerial perspective, it actually seems to fit perfectly. Imagine if it were true that the Terminan ancestors were the very people that sealed Majora's Mask away. Locked in that shadowy prison for centuries, it would be very conceivable that Majora's hatred and rage would grow to unfathomable levels. So much so that by the time the Dark Entity secured its escape, it would be reasonable and even logical to assume that Majora would seek to give those that imprisoned it a taste of the very misery it endured before ultimately destroying them in the most brutal way possible, regardless of the cost to its own life. And seeing how Majora filled the land of Termina with misery before gradually bringing a giant moon to destroy everything, even possibly itself, the claims that I make are actually quite feasible. Now, feasible or not, my theoretical claims are just that, theoretical. Considering that a theory is only as good as the evidence you have to support it, there is admittedly very little for my own theory to stand on, considering that my evidence is mostly coming from a theoretical motive that isn't even clearly defined in this game. So what makes what I proposed even remotely possible and not just some random, unsupportable guess? As it turns out, the best evidence that I had that I feel conclusively proves this theory is located in the least likely of places. The missing link that I think definitively connects Majora's Mask and the Terminin race together. Where this crucial piece of evidence lies is strangely enough with the Fierce Deity's mask. Yes, the Fierce Deity's mask. For as mysterious as this mask is, I truly believe that this mask serves as the ultimate link between the Terminins and Majora. So how exactly does this mask of no origin and little information fit into the grand scheme of things? Well, in order to understand that, you need to understand what I perceive the Fierce Deity to be, along with its potential origins. In my opinion, I actually don't believe that the Fierce Deity's mask is an ancient mask like Majora's Mask at all. If it were and had some sort of history with Majora's Mask, don't you think there would have been some kind of canonical backstory that coincided with Majora's origins? I say canonical because the manga depicting Majora's Mask's history wasn't made by Nintendo and is therefore not canon. In the game though, we don't receive any kind of origin for the Fierce Deity's mask. Not only that, it's almost as if the world didn't even know it existed. Think about that for a moment. Here we have this extremely powerful mask that is just as evil and powerful as Majora's Mask, with apparently enough history with Majora to be considered its nemesis. Yet not one soul in the land seemed to know anything about it. Not even the happy mask salesman who was an expert on masks had much to say about it. And if this mask did have such a strong connection to Majora's Mask, which the happy mask salesman obviously adores, wouldn't he have wanted to obtain the Fierce Deity's mask for his collection as well? Because of how mysterious the Fierce Deity's mask is even to those within this game, I actually theorize that this is a relatively new mask that was actually created by Majora himself moments before doing battle with Link. That may seem like a stretch to say, but look at what Link has to do in order to even get this thing. In order to obtain this mask, Link must travel into the moon to a world that Majora obviously created. Talk and play with these four masked children who could only possibly be explained as extensions of Majora's being, and finally receive the Fierce Deity's mask from none other than Majora himself. It seems a bit strange, doesn't it? In order to get the Fierce Deity's mask, Link has to travel to a world Majora created, interact with beings that are extensions of Majora's being, and then finally receive the mask directly from Majora himself. If this mask, given to Link in a world where everything that exists is the product of Majora's power, wasn't something that he created, I would be quite surprised. But the best supporting evidence that suggests Majora created the Fierce Deity's mask actually comes in the form of what I believe are the materials that were necessary to bring the mask into existence. If you recall earlier, I talked about some in-game information about a gossip stone stating that the Fierce Deity's mask was said to possess the merits of all the other masks. And if that is true, that would mean that the mask would have to have been made from the remnants of all the other masks in the game. But where exactly would the remnants have came from to bring the Fierce Deity's mask into existence? The only possible answer was that they came together when Link traded away all of his masks to the Children of the Moon. I believe that after Link gave away all the masks to the children, Majora magically fused them all together into one single mask, the end result being the Fierce Deity's mask. If this is the case, it answers two of the biggest questions plaguing the Fierce Deity's mask, namely, who created the mask and where it came from. While this would explain at least a possible origin for the Fierce Deity's mask, it doesn't necessarily explain anything else. We still aren't given any indication as to what the Fierce Deity is or how this mask even remotely links Majora's mask to the Terminin race as I suggest it does. So how can we answer these lingering, puzzling questions about the Fierce Deity's mask? Ironically enough, the answer to both questions can be answered by looking at one simple thing. I believe that Majora's mask and the Terminin race are linked together because of what the Fierce Deity's mask actually is. So let's focus on that question to see exactly how it answers the other. What exactly is the Fierce Deity? What is this mysterious form that Link takes on when wearing this mask? Is the form that of some sort of ancient god? Could it possibly be an imprisoned spirit similar to Majora? What is the Fierce Deity? If you were to ask me for my thoughts on the subject, despite the mask's name, I don't think that the Fierce Deity's form is either a god or a dark spirit at all. Instead, I think it's actually something that is a little bit more down to earth, or Termina in this case. In my opinion, I actually believe that the Fierce Deity is nothing more than the embodiment of an ancient Terminin. I can picture it now. Many of you probably thinking, what? An ancient Terminin? What would possibly make you come to that conclusion? What makes me believe that the form Link takes on is that of an ancient Terminin and not some sort of god or dark spirit is because of the form's physical and spiritual characteristics. What we clearly know about the Fierce Deity's mask is that it is a transformation mask. However, the physical form that Link assumes when he puts on this particular mask is very strange. Usually, whenever Link puts on a transformation mask, whether it be the Deku mask, the Goron mask, or the Zora's mask, Link will transform into a member of that race and inherit their respective physical features. The form that Link takes on when he puts on the Fierce Deity's mask, though, isn't truly all that different. Sure, Link does acquire some bizarre cosmetic changes, but his base form is essentially the same. He retains most of the characteristics that would identify him as either a Hylian or a Terminin, namely the elf-like ears and the human physique. In fact, aside from the cosmetic changes, Link in this form is more or less just his adult self. While Link may not change so much in terms of his race, what does change drastically is his apparel, which becomes quite ancient, if not somewhat tribal, in nature. Link's attire while wearing the Fierce Deity's mask is very reminiscent of a medieval warrior. The plated armor, armored gauntlets, and decorative sword that Link wields appear to be very old, to the point of rusting and even cracking from their advanced age. The marking on Link's face seemed to be that of tribal tattoos reminiscent of a warrior's culture, something similar to real-world tribal warriors like the Maui in ancient times. So based off of everything we see in the Fierce Deity physically, here we have what seems to be an ancient, tribal-looking warrior with the physical characteristics of a Terminin. Based on those observations alone, what would you guess this form to be? Because of the form's physical characteristics, I don't think anyone would argue that the Fierce Deity isn't some sort of ancient being. The ancient part of this form is very apparent and easy to accept as truth, but perhaps the evidence isn't quite there enough to buy the claim that this being is in fact a Terminin. It's true that the physical characteristics of this form can't prove that the Fierce Deity is of the Terminin race, but the spiritual characteristics of this form certainly do. Like the other transformation masks referenced earlier, it is implied that the Fierce Deity's mask contains a powerful spirit within it. But whose spirit resides in the mask is the question we are left asking ourselves. What I've come to theorize is that there isn't necessarily just one spirit within this mask, but rather many spirits forged into one soul. I believe that the Fierce Deity's soul is the combined essence of the entire Terminin race fused into one form. Thus, when Link transforms into the Fierce Deity by wearing the mask, he assumes the soul that is the embodiment of the entire Terminin race. This is a pretty radical claim for me to make, perhaps, but I have a reason for thinking it's so. What made me come to this conclusion about the Fierce Deity's soul was because of some rather telling information given to us not by the game, but by one of the game's developers. Prior to the release of Majora's Mask for the 3DS, a reporter asked Eiji Aonuma, the game's developer, about the Fierce Deity's mask. When asked about it, he made a very interesting comment. Aonuma said, and I quote, "The best way to think about it is that the memories of all the people of Termina are inside of the Fierce Deity's mask." That is a very interesting statement, is it not? While Aonuma was actually explaining why Link feels intense pain when putting on the Fierce Deity's mask, the quote still raises a very interesting question. How could the Fierce Deity's mask contain all the memories of the people of Termina if they weren't in some way a part of the mask? Based on that quote alone, we have what I feel is the best supporting evidence to suggest that the soul of the Fierce Deity's mask is actually the physical manifestation of a Terminin soul created from the essence of the entire Terminin race. That thought may be a little freaky to think about, but perhaps there are still some lingering doubts that the Fierce Deity is what I claim it to be. If such doubts do exist, they are probably centered around one question, that being, at what point in the game did the entire Terminin race get together and fuse their essence together to create the Fierce Deity's soul? That moment in the game came ironically enough in the moon when Link gave to Majora all the masks he had obtained throughout his adventure. What many people don't realize is just how important those seemingly worthless masks that Link gave away were. While the masks didn't seem like much to the player, they were priceless in their own right to the Terminins. Each one tells a story and holds within them the memories, emotions, and possibly even the very essence of the people of Termina. So when Link gave away the masks to Majora for him to crest the Fierce Deity's mask, Link was giving Majora not just the remnants of the game's masks, but also the very essence of the people of Termina. Thus, when Majora crafted the Fierce Deity's mask, he forged the Terminin soul of the mask using the very essence of the entire Terminin race. After having thoroughly examined the Fierce Deity's physical and spiritual characteristics, I would like to reiterate my theory again. I believe that the Fierce Deity is in fact an ancient Terminin, and after everything I've put forth, perhaps you can see some truth to that as well. Even if we have successfully identified what the Fierce Deity is and where it came from, it still hasn't been clarified how this mask serves as the link to Majora's mask in the Terminin race. Though it may certainly seem that way, Majora himself already told us how this mask serves as that very link. Recall on the moon when the child wearing Majora's mask gave Link the Fierce Deity's mask. After giving Link the mask, Majora referred to Link and the mask as the bad guy for their gain. The question is, why would Majora have referred to our hero and the mask he gave him as the villain? The only logical explanation is that Majora saw whatever the Fierce Deity was as its nemesis. Having established that the Fierce Deity is most likely every Terminin soul fused together, Majora had to have seen the Terminin race as his enemy. And why exactly would Majora see the Terminin race as his enemy? It all goes back to the only known negative interaction Majora ever had with the outside world, when the dark entity was sealed away in his shadowy prison for a supposed eternity. Thus we have not only the link between Majora and the Terminin race, but also potential proof that the ancient Terminins were the very ones who in fact sealed Majora away. With all that said, there is certainly a lot to think about. There is though one thing that stands out about the Fierce Deity's mask that seems out of place. If everything I presented is true and Majora did create the Fierce Deity's mask exactly the way I've suggested, why exactly did Majora create it to start with? And what was the purpose of just giving it to Link? It's the answer to this question that brings my theory to a complete circle. It was all part of Majora's elaborate scheme to get what I've come to believe is the ultimate revenge against the Terminin race. What I think Majora planned to do upon being released from his prison was to first inflict as much misery upon the Terminins as he possibly could to give them a taste of the very misery he had endured for countless years. After this, I believe Majora fully intended to destroy the Terminin race in the most brutal way possible, by incinerating them into oblivion with the falling moon. However, simply inflicting misery and destroying the Terminins wasn't enough to quench his thirst for vengeance. So as an added tactic, I think that Majora also wanted to destroy the very essence of the Terminin race, and chose to do so by crafting their gathered essence into one being that would take on the form of his ancient foe that had sealed him away. As the moon would fall, destroying everything and everyone in the land, I think Majora would do battle against his ancient foe with the full intention of defeating them simply for gratification. And even though it meant potentially giving up his own life in the process, I believe that the dark entity truly sought to not only destroy his enemy, but conquer their very essence as part of what I've come to consider as the perfect revenge. Strangely enough, if Majora had succeeded in his battle against Link, the Dark Entity's efforts would have, in my opinion, gone down as one of the most brilliant and successful revenge plots in video game history. There is honestly no better way to achieve the perfect revenge than simultaneously destroying your enemy as well as the very idea of them and stamping them out of history forever. Unfortunately, there is one fact about all of this that really stands out, one that puts my so-called theory into jeopardy. If Majora had such a brilliant plan for getting revenge against the Terminin race as I suggested, why did he end up losing his final battle against Link? In my theory, I've made Majora out to be this brilliant, powerful being with abilities far beyond anything we could ever comprehend. Yet, in the final stages of his plan, he was defeated not only by Link, but by the very mask that he had given to him. How could this have possibly happened? The answer to this question, in my opinion, is actually less elaborate than you'd expect it to be. I actually think that the only reason that Majora lost and his plan ultimately failed was because the dark entity simply underestimated his foe. That may sound like a cop-out to be sure, but just stop to think about this for a moment. Any time that Majora's Mask came into contact with Link, the Dark Spirit always had the upper hand. There was not one encounter between Majora's Mask and Link prior to their final battle where Link had any sort of noteworthy advantages. So as a result, Majora obviously wouldn't have had any reason to see Link as anything other than a nuisance. The biggest mistake Majora made in his plan was when he decided to indulge what he must have seen as a stubborn child. I think he chose Link to be the warrior he would do battle against to conquer his ancient foe and secure his ultimate revenge. Yet Majora had no idea just how much power he was granting to Link. I think that if the Fierce Deity's mask had been given to anyone else in Termina, the battle between Majora and that warrior would have been more evenly matched, if not somewhat lopsided in Majora's favor. But instead, Majora unwittingly gave the mask to the child he simply saw as a nuisance. Yet as we know, Link is not just any child. He is the hero of time and the hero chosen by the goddesses. By giving the Fierce Deity's mask to Link, Link obtained a way to unleash the full potential granted to him by his adult form. At the same time, however, he had the essence of every soul in Termina added to his abilities, granting him unbelievable power. With access to his full potential, the divine power of the Hylian goddesses behind him, and the essence of the entire Terminan race coursing through him, is it any wonder how Link became so powerful that not even a single foe in this game could stand against him for long? Majora didn't realize what level of power he was granting Link, and it ultimately cost him everything. So that is my theory. I've laid out before you what I believe are not only the answers to the biggest mysteries surrounding Majora's Mask and the Fierce Deity's mask, but also the potential untold story behind the game's narrative. I have come to believe that the unidentified tribe mentioned by the Happy Mask salesman was actually the ancestors of the Terminan race. After being sealed away, Majora spent his eternity in prison plotting the perfect revenge against those that had imprisoned him. A plot that included bringing upon the Terminan race misery, death, and oblivion in every conceivable way. Near the final stages of his plan, Majora took the masks that Link had given to him, thus the essence of the entire Terminan race, and fused them together into one soul that would become the embodiment of his ancient foe. Hoping to conquer this being as part of the perfect revenge, Majora was so caught up in his plot and thirst for vengeance that he underestimated our hero, Link. In doing so, what Majora had created to conquer for vengeance, Link ultimately used to conquer him. The hero of time destroyed the evil being that plagued Majora's Mask, and the rest is history. This is the theory I've come to believe. Of course, though, this is just a theory. There is nothing to say that anything I presented here is written in stone as fact. The fact of the matter is, this theory of mine is just one of a million that exists to try and explain the mysteries surrounding this amazing Zelda title. And without any further confirmation from Nintendo to explain the unknown, the mysteries within The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask will always exist, as well as the numerous theories that try to explain them. But until the day Nintendo officially chooses to reveal the answers to the many mysteries that surround this game, this is the theory I will choose to believe.